Good morning. We begin today's daf Tes Zayin, Maseches Bava Metzia. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank all of our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Adar Sheni. We thank the Schwarzbaum Family for dedicating and for sponsoring all the shiurim of this month in memory of Aaron J. Schwarzbaum, Aharon Yosef, and Meir. May his neshama have an aliyah. We also thank Leah Sol for sponsoring and dedicating all of the shiurim of this month in the zechus of her daughter Ilana Bas Esther's successful surgery and a complete refuah sheleima for a safe return of all of our hostages. We also thank Maia Hoffman for dedicating and sponsoring all the shiurim of this month in memory of her father, Reuven ben Emanuel, the Meir of hatzlacha and health and joy of all of her family, Shulamit, Avraham, Mariasha Tzivia, Barak Raphael, and Dora. We also thank Yoel Sara Kelman for sponsoring all the shiurim and dedicating all the shiurim of this month in honor of the birth of their son and in memory of Staff Sergeant Sasson, who was only 21 years old and was killed fighting in Gaza on March 6, 2024. The merit of all of our TALMUD TORAH, all the neshama should have an aliyah, all the cholim should have refuah, and all those need Yeshua should have a Yeshua. Today's daf is daf Tes Zayin, and we are picking up at the two dots, somewhere around a little bit more than 10 lines down on daf Tes Zayin. So just a quick reminder of what we were talking about yesterday, because today's Gemara is directly linked to that. We are discussing a case where a Gaza, a thief, sold a field to somebody else, and then subsequently goes and he buys the field from its rightful owner. And then the Gemara spent time yesterday trying to kind of psychoanalyze this guy. Like, why did he buy it? What was up with that? Why did the guy buy it? He stole the field originally, and he sold the field. So it seems like, from this guy's perspective, he's done. He's got the best of both worlds. He didn't have to pay for the field when he originally got it, and he made money off of it. So what's going through his mind now when he goes ahead and he buys the field? So yesterday we went through this Gemara fairly quickly because it was the end of the shir. But just to quickly remind ourselves, the Gemara told us that when the thief sells the field to the subsequent buyer, he sells it in kol zechus shetava liyada. He's selling the zechus, he's selling the field not only with the rights or lack thereof that he has to the field today, but he's selling every right he eventually may acquire with regard to this field. And therefore, when he goes ahead and subsequently buys it from the person that he stole it from, then he's buying it to transfer those rights to the person who bought it from him. Now the Gemara wants to know, why would he do this? What's his motivation to do this? The Gemara asked why would he do that? The Gemara gave two possible explanations. Both of them are very similar. One of them is he doesn't want to be called a thief. Although he is a thief, and although he probably has to acknowledge that he's a thief, it's very painful to have to be called a thief and to be publicly called a thief. So therefore, despite the fact that, as we mentioned before, he got what he wanted, he got the money for the field, again, he doesn't want to be called a thief. It's very embarrassing to be called a thief. The other one was that he doesn't want to ruin his reputation. He doesn't want his name to be dragged through the mud. So when it comes out that the field is determined to be stolen, and then everyone knows about it, it's very embarrassing. Actually, I'll just share a quick anecdote. A number of years ago, when I bought my first used car. So I went to one of these wonderful people. Everyone knows used car salesmen have the best name out there. But either way, I bought a car from this guy, and one morning I was actually in shul, in the middle of davening, and a guy comes in and says, "Anybody own a blue Toyota Camry?" So now in Lakewood, New Jersey, where I was at that point in time, everyone got up out of their seat, because who doesn't have a blue Toyota Camry? It turns out it was mine. And I went outside, still wearing my talismans felon, and there were a bunch of cops around my car. And it turns out my car was being taken away because my car was stolen. And they said to me, "Sir, we'll take your car. We're going to bring it back to the proper owner. The car belongs to somebody in Florida. This car's been stolen from Florida." Now, the truth of the matter is that it was my car. I bought it. I had the receipt. I paid for the car. And the problem really was that the car was repossessed by Toyota and then sold off to some used car dealer who sold it to me. But somewhere in the paperwork, while Toyota had repossessed it, the Department of Motor Vehicles never acknowledged that the vehicle was taken back by Toyota, and it was, and the VIN number still tracked back to the original person who reported it stolen the morning that the repo guy came and took it. Now, why am I mentioning this story? Because I remember at the time I bought it from a Jewish car salesman, and it said on the back of the car, they put like their logo on the back of the car. And I remember he called me and he said to me, "What is going on? Why am I getting 100 phone calls that I'm selling stolen cars?" So I told him, "Well, actually, you did." Well, because at that point in time, my car was impounded, my car was gone. But you see that the guy happens to be an honest guy. But ultimately, the shame of being called a ganav, when all this, everyone finds out, there's the scene, people come, they take away the field. The ganav stole the field, and he made money off the field. But to have people call him a ganav is something he just doesn't want to have to deal with. So therefore, at a certain point, he says, "You know what? I made money off the field. It's true that I stole it, but to avoid the public shaming, number one, of my reputation, number two, to be called a gazlan is just very unpleasant, and therefore he wanted to buy it back." That was yesterday's Gemara. The Gemara gave a couple differences between these two different opinions, but that's ultimately.
Did you get the car back?
I got the car back. Yes, I got the car back. Yeah. I had to pay the impound fee until I got it back, but I was able to get it back a couple days later. I guess one more anecdote while we're on the topic. When I was in Eretz Yisrael as a bacher, we lived in this Bachram Dira, this apartment, and we had just extremely expensive water bills. We just couldn't figure out why are our water bills so expensive. 6 or 7 guys living in an apartment. Okay, we took showers, but that expensive until we discovered that our next door neighbor didn't have a legal apartment. What better idea than to just connect your water source to your next door neighbor? Perfect. Made a lot of sense. And we watched how they outside there's just one of these homemade pipes that just connected straight to our water line. So one day, we just turned on the way out. We all left. We turned off the water. There's a little knob outside. We turned off the water, and we get a phone call from the owner, the landlord of the next door. "What are you doing? Why are you turning off the water? My tenant in the apartment couldn't do laundry. He couldn't cook." Well, we said, "Well, it's our water." Anyway, he felt that he has the rights to the water. I remember at that point in time, he was literally stealing our water, and we had to pay for it for months. At a point in time, I think it was me actually, one of us said to him, "You're a ganav. You're taking our water, and we have to pay for it." At that moment, he lost it. Absolutely lost it. "You call me a ganav? You know who I am, a ganav?" Well, actually, yes. That's what you're doing. You're taking the water, you're not paying for it, and he had no plans to pay for it. But again, the idea, even though he was a ganav, you call him a ganav. When someone hears he's called a ganav, it's such a heavy term to use. "I'm a thief?" Really? There's all types of things that people sometimes would do. What's the big deal? It's a little bit of water. I'm just taking it. These guys are a bunch of American bachram anyway. What do they care? A couple extra $100 and some water. They can handle it. They're not going to go broke off of that. When the moment you realize, hey, I'm a ganav. So that's when the person says, let's try to make this right. That's what the Gemara was talking about. The guy is a ganav. He stole the field. And he sold the field afterwards. But ultimately, he doesn't want to be called a ganav. Now, in today's Gemara, the Gemara is going to continue that discussion, but it's going to be interesting. The Gemara seems to start off, and we'll see this in a minute, really just going with the other reason about his reputation. He seems to be worried about his reputation, so we're going to start today with Pshita, Zabna Orta V'Yava B'Matana. The Gemara now is trying to understand when this, let's just call him what he is, this thief, goes ahead and buys the field, and we're psychoanalyzing this guy, why did he buy it again? So the Gemara says, if he sold the field to this original buyer, and then before he went and bought the field legitimately, he sold it again. So this guy's out of his mind. He buys it, he steals it, sells it. Now remember, that sale, we're going to discuss later, is really not a sale. He's selling the Brooklyn Bridge, he doesn't own it. But again, the Gemara says it's obvious, Pshita Zavna, he sold it again, Orta, or he inherited it to his children, V'yavav Matana, or he gave it as a gift to somebody else, and then afterwards, he goes ahead and buys it. The Gemara says, Lav la'ukmi kama lokeach kabay. His motivation is not like this, the original buyer can be able to legitimately own it. Because if he legitimately was trying to make things right, it's like this, the subsequent buyer can actually legally own the field that he bought. He wouldn't have gone ahead to circumvent that by giving it or selling it to another person. So he's bringing in a third party, say a fourth party into the sale. Clearly he's not motivated by making it right for the first buyer. Gemara says, Nafalei b'Yerusha, then what happens if the guy who stole the field, he stole it from a relative that he was slated to inherit? So he stole it, let's just say he stole the fields from his father. Unfortunately, those kinds of things can happen. His father may have been getting old. His father couldn't really take care of his stuff anymore, so he just took his father's field. He took it without paying for it. Now he sold it, and then his father passed away. Now his father passes away, he inherits his father, so now the field is legitimately owned by the thief. So the question is, in that case, can we really say that he went out of his way to go buy or to acquire the fields like this, the buyer will legitimately own it? The Gemara says, Nafle b'Yerusha, well Yerusha memelehi, v'lav iu katarach abasra. So therefore, there's no reason to say that now that he owns it legitimately, he has any intention to actually pass it on to the lokech, like this, the buyer will legitimately own it. However, gavi iu b'chovo, if he collected that field as payment for a loan that he's owed, then the Gemara says it depends. Chazina, we have to analyze this. I isli arach riti v'amar haybo'ina, then l'ukma kami lokeach kavoi. If this thief also lent money to another person, and the person never paid him back. So now the thief goes and says, Sir, you legitimately owe me money, and I'd like to collect your real estate instead. Now, if the debtor, the one who owes the money, actually owns lots of real estate, and he intentionally says, I would like to collect that field that I sold to that person, so the fact that he's choosing that field indicates that the reason why he wants that field is because he wants to be able to create legitimacy to the sale that he made earlier. He's doing it to benefit the lokech. V'ilo, if not, if the guy doesn't have any other fields, is the only one, zuzi hu debaya fruit. That's what he wants. He wants his money. Therefore, he collects whatever he can get his hands on. Gemara says, Yavan aleh b'matana. What if the victim of the theft decided to ultimately give the field to the thief as a gift? So there, pligi bar of Achav Ravina. Rav Achav and Ravina argue about how we view that. Chad Amar matana ki Yerusha, the Hamamela. One of them says, just like when it comes to inheritance, he had nothing to do with it. He didn't go out of his way to try to substantiate his legal ownership over this field. So like this, the buyer could actually legitimately own the field. It happened by itself. So matana is the same thing. A person decides to give you a gift. You've done nothing to actually earn that gift. It was just given to you. The Chadam, the other one, says it's not true. Matana kamecha. Matana is much more similar to actually going out of your way to buy it. Di'ilav de tarach v'artzi kamei lo haviyavle matana. Nobody gets a free gift. You have to have done something to indicate that this is what you want. You have to actually earn the gift somehow. Doesn't mean you bought it, doesn't mean you paid for it, but people don't just show up to people's house and say, oh, by the way, I want to let you know, I bought you a house. That's just not how it works. If someone's going to give you a gift of real estate, there must have been something that you've done, number one, to deserve it, and number two, to indicate that that's what you want. So it's much more similar to a mekach, where the person went ahead and bought it. Now the Gemara goes on to explain Yevachad Amar Matana Kamecher, the Ilav the Tarach Vartzi Kameh lo Haviyav Le Matana, Lahachi, therefore, Tarach Vartzi Kameh, that's why he went out of his way to appease him, is Kihechi Delekum Behemenuse. The Gemara seems to go with that reason. The Gemara seems to say the reason why he went out of his way to try to convince this person to give him this field as a gift is because he wanted to be able to protect his reputation. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, I'm sorry, we skipped a line. V'ad emas. The Gemara asks the question, V'ad emas, until what point in time do we assume that a person is purchasing this field because he wants to protect his reputation? In other words, you can't say this goes on forever, so at what point in time do we say he wants to do that? Until he ultimately gets taken to court. At that point in time, if after he's taken to court, and based in he's already being held responsible for the fact that he stole the field, at that point in time, then he goes ahead and buys it, so then it's too late. His reputation is already he clearly wasn't so concerned about his reputation, and therefore if he's buying it, he's not buying it because he wants to help out the lokeach. Chia Barav says, Adamata adrachta liyadeh. It's not until he's taken to court, he gives him some more time. It's until the actual document that says he has to give up the field makes it to his hand. At that point in time, he can no longer say that he's trying to protect his reputation, and what he's doing it on behalf of the lokeach. And Rav Papa Amar Ad de Mischalin Yomi Achar Zasa, until the days of announcement start happening. What does that mean? So basically, there's 3 steps over here. Step number 1 is a person's taken to court, he's summoned to Beis Din. The second one is, after the legal proceedings, is going to be a psak that's given, and then there's a point in time when the Beis Din starts making announcements that the fields are for sale. So it's 3 different stages in this process, and the Gemara has machlokes. At what point in time the person can still say he's trying to protect his reputation, and he's buying it to legitimize the sale that he sold to this first person. Now the Gemara asks a very simple, fundamental question. Maskef law, Rami Bar Papa. Mechdi. Let's take a look and analyze this. In other words, we spent a lot of time trying to understand what went through the mind of this thief. And we're ultimately determining that when he buys the field from the person he stole it from, he's buying it because he wants the original sale of when he sold the field to this innocent purchaser to be legitimate. The problem just is a technical issue. The buyer never bought the field. He was sold the Brooklyn Bridge. If I sell you someone else's house, I could do whatever I want, all kinds of acrobatics, but ultimately the bottom line is, I didn't sell anything to you. That's Gemara's question right now. How does he actually acquire this field? With that original contract that he signed to buy that field? This shtar is a chas, it's a piece of broken pottery. In other words, it's a piece of garbage. He bought something, he has a shtar that says he bought a field from someone who doesn't own the field. So very nice, later he wanted to buy it, but at the end of the day there was no kinyan, nothing happened. And when he tried to make a kinyan, the whole thing was just a clown show, because the guy was selling someone else's field. So very nice, he tries to substantiate it, but the bottom line is, he never sold the field. Amalei Rava responded and said, Tehebe Mamino. This works with an element of trust. In other words, he says, B'hahu hana, with that pleasure, the lo ka'amarle midi, the kasamach aleha tarach omaisile v'gamar umaknile. The Gemara says, this thief, again, he has dignity. He appreciates the fact that this buyer trusted him. The way that Tosfos says this is, it's as if he said to him, in other words, you rely on me, you trust me, I appreciate that I have your trust. That trust that he gave him at the time that he actually signed this really useless contract, that is the item of value that he gave him that allows him to actually buy the field. That pleasure that he has, that this guy trusts me, doesn't call me a thief. He relies on me, that I will ultimately do everything I can to be able to legitimately bring this field to his ownership, that's enough. Now, it's as if he said to him, when I actually really buy it, or she said, when I'm going to buy it, that's when it's going to ultimately be yours. The problem just with this is, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but Tosfos seems to take the approach at the beginning of this sugya, that when the guy bought it, he didn't know it was stolen. If he knew it was stolen, it's a whole other set of problems. So I don't know how consistent it is, but ultimately, whether or not the buyer actually had that in mind, still, the seller, this thief, still received that pleasure that this guy's relying on me, he trusts me, and the fact that he's trusting on me is enough, he's trusting me, that's enough for him to actually be given an item of value at the time of the sale. The Gemara says, okay, very nice. So that's how it works. He gives him pleasure at the time of the sale, and ultimately later, when he really buys it and really owns it, then he's going to be able to get it. The Gemara says, Mosaver Sheshus. If Sheshus asks the following question, what happens if a person says, Ma she'irish mi abba machor lecha? What I will ultimately inherit from my father will be sold to you. Or Ma she'tala mitsudasi. What my trap will eventually catch, a person puts traps down into the sea, and he hopes that his traps bring up a lot of fish. What my traps will eventually catch, machor lecha, is sold to you. Gemara says, Lo Amar Klum. It's nothing, because nothing going on there. However, what I will inherit from my father today, in other words, the person says, I have a reality check, my father's life is coming to an end, and he knows that his father is going to be dying that day. See, at the end of his life, he's a goses. So what I'm going to get from my father today, machar lach, I'm selling to you. Or, mashav talam mutzadasi hayom, what my trap is going to pick up today, machar lach, is sold to you, dvar of kayamin. His words actually are going to work, and the sale takes place. The Gemara is going to explain the difference between these two cases later. So now, the problem is, you see from the first half of this, that even though I know something will eventually come, if it's not here today, I can't sell it. We're going to see the discussion of a person sells something shelo bala olam, davar shelo bala olam. You sell something which is not here, the sale doesn't work. So how is it that I could say that the field is sold to this innocent buyer over here because later I'm going to acquire it? Amar Rabbi Bar Chama, Hi Gavra. He says, wow, Rav Sheshus, this is really a Gavra. He's a very special person. V'hat yufta. This is a real, legitimate refutation of what we were saying. In other words, it can't possibly be that he's selling him something that he doesn't yet own. It won't work. Rava responded, and he said, Gavra kachazina. I see a very special person in Rav Sheshus. He actually asked a very good question. However, v'tiyufta lo kachazina. There's no refutation over here. And he explains, hachasam chadaite. In our case of selling the field, he relied on him. He trusted him. V'hacha, in the case of selling something that you'll eventually come to own, lo sam chadaite. He doesn't rely on him. Which, without getting too deep into the sugya of davar shelo bala olam, this Gemara happens to be a big source that the problem of selling something which doesn't yet exist is whether or not I rely on the fact that the thing's going to come into existence. That's how the Gemara seems to differentiate between the two cases, is do I rely on the fact that it will ultimately come? The Gemara says, Hacha sam chadaite, hacha lo sam chadaite, hacha sam chadaite da alzo v'tarach u'maisele. In this case, he relies on the fact the guy will get it for him. Ki hechid lo nikru glazlana. He knows the person has this motivation, which is interesting. Earlier, the Gemara went with the reason of protecting his reputation. Over here it says, the buyer knows that he's going to ultimately get it, because everyone wants to make sure no one calls them bad names. No one wants to be called a Gazlan, and therefore he says, if this guy doesn't really get a hold of the field, he's going to go down in the books as a Gazlan, and that's something he doesn't want. So I know I can rely on the fact he doesn't want to be called a Gazlan, and he'll get it from me. In this case, where he's making the sale, he doesn't rely on him because, again, he's not a Gazlan. He may have sold something and never got his hands on it, but he didn't steal it either. Shalchot l'kamed Rav Abba bar Zavta. Amar lahu, they sent the same thing, the same question to Rabbi Abba bar Zavta. Amar lahu, he said to them, Zu ein tzricha lifnim. This is such a good question. Ein tzricha lifnim. You don't even have to bother bringing it to the base medrash because it's a tiyufta, it's a refutation. Amar Rava, actually not. Zu tzricha lifnim v'lifnai v'lifnim. We got to take this into the base medrash, to the deepest thinkers, to the biggest chacham, have them analyze this. Why? Because hachasam chadaite. Like we said before, our case of the sale, he relies on him. In this case, he does not rely on him. There's a story, a similar story like this. And they asked this question. You don't have to bother asking this question because again, it's such a strong refutation. Abaye responded and said, actually not. You got to bring it inside. Go bring it into the innermost chambers of the base medrash, because again, the same discussion. There's a difference between a case where a person sells something that he does not yet own, and a person sells something that he already stole, because, as we said before, a person who sells something that he stole, he wants to protect himself. That's what we call the Gazlan, and therefore the person relies on the fact that he will ultimately take ownership on it, so he relies on it, and his sale is complete. Now, if you remember, in the question that we asked, we had two scenarios. Scenario one was the case where a person says he wants to sell to somebody something that he will eventually inherit, no timeline, just eventually, or he sells him something that will eventually come into his trap. That doesn't work. But if he uses the word hayom, that it will come into my trap today, or that he will inherit today, that does work. Gemara says, "Umayshna reisha, umayshna seifa." What's the difference? In both cases, at the time of the sale, he doesn't own it. Rabbi Yochanan seifa masha irish mi abba hayom mishum kod aviv. In that case, where he's talking about what he's going to inherit today, it's for the honor of his father. And Rashi explains, last line in Rashi, Kishahaya aviv goses v'tzarach mos lekvuraso ulutachrichin muzar l'chvod aviv shelo la'shoso v'bizayon. In the case where he knows he needs money, his father's about to pass away, he has to pay the burial expenses, he has to pay the funeral home, he has to pay for the tachrichin. He needs that money. So therefore, he's going to make sure that whatever he inherits transfers right away. So the person relies on the fact his father's dying, he's a ghost, he's on his deathbed. The property will come to him today, and he knows that the sale will be complete because this person needs the money, and therefore it's a real legitimate sale. The same thing is true. Masha talbim mitzadasei hayom, top of tezayin with beis. The reason why that works is mishum kitei chayav. Person saying today, you know why he's saying today? Because he needs the money today. He needs to be able to bring dinner home for his family. And therefore, the person understands if he's selling what he's going to be trapping today, that's something I can rely on, because the person needs to be able to bring a meal home, and it's a good sale. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, Amar Rav, the name of Rav. Ha'omar lechavero. A person tells his friend, Sadeh sha'ani lokeach, a field that I'm going to eventually buy, likishe ekochena kenuya lecha me'achshav. I didn't yet make this deal. I'm working on it. I'm trying to get all the paperwork in order, trying to crunch the numbers, have a couple of details in the contract that have to be hashed out, but ultimately, likishe ekochena, when the sale closes, and when it finalizes, kenuya lecha me'achshav, it should be sold to you today. Halacha is, kana. He owns it. Amar Rava comments on this and he says, Mistavra, it seems to make sense that when Rav Huna said this in the name of Rav, that a person could sell a field from today that he's going to buy later, that's talking about a case, Milsa de Rav Besada Stam. That's just if he says, you know, I'm a real estate guy, I'm eventually going to buy some fields, then in such a case it will work. Aval Besada Zu, if he points to a very specific field, low. It's not good. He doesn't work. Why? He's not going to rely on him because miyemar the mazdin law nehalei. In other words, when you're talking about a very specific field, the odds are not so much in your favor, because if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. There's no recourse. But if you're talking about just in general a field, there's always a field that's available to be bought. So therefore, the chances of the sale actually coming through are much higher when you give a much more broad availability. v'halokim, which is a very strong lashon of a shavua, of confidence. That Amar Rav said this, afilu b'sad zu, even when it comes to a very specific field, and again, the stakes are high and the chances of not working out because there's no other field to work on, but again, he even meant it when he was talking about a specific field. Because Mechdi, why is Rav saying this? Let's analyze, why is it that Rav allows a person to sell a field that he doesn't yet own? Because Rav Kaman Amro L'Shmaite Rav Meir. Rav was saying his memra, his statement was in accordance with the opinion of Rav Meir. Who's Rav Meir? To Amar, he says, the person can actually sell something that doesn't yet exist. To Tanya, for it says in the Brisa, the Omer Leisha. Person says to a woman, I actually think that I learned this Gemara in Daf Yomi with you when we learned Masechus Kedushin. He says, "Eskachi li la'achar she'esgayer." You'll get married to me. You'll be mekudeshes to me after I convert, or la'achar she'esgayri. After you complete your conversion, you're going to be married to me. Again, at that point in time, they can't get married because one of them are not Jewish. La'achar she'eshtachrer. After I will be freed, I'll be emancipated from my master, or la'achar she'eshtachriri. After you get free. Or la'achar sheyamas bailech. One of the most insensitive things for a person to say. A person goes to him and says, listen, I know your husband got a short amount of time left. After he's gone, I'm ready to go. Okay? La'achar sheyachas lach. After your yivama, when this woman falls to yibam, so she is zakuk to this yibam, she's not allowed to get married until chalitza happens and she frees herself up from the yibam. So he says, after your sister dies. This is even worse. What's this talking about? It's talking about where a guy is married to a woman and his wife is not well. So he goes over to his sister-in-law, which actually this is the only case of Aryeh where the pasuk says b'chayeha. The issur to marry your sister-in-law is only while his wife is still alive. Once his wife passes, he's allowed to marry his sister-in-law. Unlike Eshes Ach, in this case, he is not allowed to marry his sister-in-law as long as his wife is alive. So he goes to his sister-in-law and says, listen, when your sister dies, you're going to be married to me. So again, at that point in time, it's an issur to get married. The kedushin is not going to work. But he's marrying her for after his wife, who's the sister of this girl, dies. Don't ever do that. Okay? Eina mekudeshes. The halacha is, Eina mekudeshes. Rav Meir says, mekudeshes. Now, v'ha'isha zu. So v'ha'isha kisad zu. It's a very specific woman. And he's relying on a certain set of facts to come true in order for this specific woman to be married to him. Kisad zu damya, Meir still said it's going to work. So clearly, Rab, who's following Meir's opinion, even though there's no guarantee that it's going to actually come through, nevertheless, it works. So therefore, even if a person says, I'm selling you this field for when I ultimately purchase it, according to Rav and according to Rav Meir, it's going to work. Amar Shmuel, Hamotzi shtar hakna b'shuk. If you remember, two daf ago, we talked about a shtar hakna. What's a shtar hakna? Shtar hakna is when a person writes a contract and commits himself prematurely to give over his assets, even though he didn't necessarily even borrow the money yet. So basically, he's meshabed himself to give over his property, even though there really is no loan that allows it to happen. We mentioned this before with regard to finding certain types of documents, and now the Gemara analyzes that case. Hamotzi shtar hakna b'shuk. A person finds a shtar where a person obligated, he put his properties on lien in that document even before the loan. He finds such a document in the market, yachziru l'bailim, he should return it to the proper owner. The Gemara explains, why not? Because the imishum, the cost of lovos v'lo lava, what are you worried about? Why shouldn't you give it back? Because maybe he wrote the document with the intention to borrow money, but never actually borrowed money. Well, too bad. Hishabad nafshe. That's the point of ishtar hakna. A person prematurely obligates himself to another person, understanding that there's a high level of risk that the loan may never actually take place. Why would a person do this? I don't know. But I guess for the purpose of this person's, whatever he's motivated for, maybe he thinks he has to write this in order to get the loan, so therefore he puts his properties on lien. That's the risk that he took, that he might not ever get the loan. But he ultimately obligated himself to this person. If you're worried that the actual loan did happen, but he paid it up, and therefore you're going to give back the shtar hakna, you're going to give the ability to the lender to collect his properties illegally, well, the Gemara says, lo chashina le'parayin. We're not worried about those kinds of things. Why? Dim isa depare, the guy actually paid up his loan, mikra havikarle, he should have ripped up the document. The fact that he did not rip up the document is an indication that he did not pay back. Amar Rav Nachman says, Abba, my father, min safri dayane demar Shmuel havi. My father was one of the scribes who wrote the documents, wrote the contracts for the Beis Din of Shmuel. V'havi kvar shita kvar sheva. I was about 6 or 7 years old. V'dacharna, and I remember to havi machrizi v'amar. They would make announcements that they would say, Hani shtari akneyasa demishtakhi b'shuka nahadre lemarayu. I remember they would constantly announce in that Beis Din, if you find a shtar hakna in the shuk, give it back to the owner. Interestingly, it's not clear if what he's saying over here is like a halachic psak based off of this, or he's just backing up the psak that we said earlier. In other words, Shmuel told us hamotzi shtar hakna b'shuk yachzir l'bayla. Now, clearly, we're talking about Shmuel's Beis Din, so we don't really need his testimony that that's what happened, because we have this line quoted from Shmuel, but he's saying he was 6 or 7. He's a katan, he's a child at that point in time. So it's hard to believe that his testimony would be accepted later to validate it, although 6 or 7 years old is an age where a child can start to comprehend what's going on. But again, it seems like he's just ultimately saying, yes, I actually remember this. My father worked in that Beis Din. I would come with my father to work. Every time it was bring your kids to work day. And I remember they'd have this announcement that would go out all the time. And they would say, when it comes to the shtar hakna, you find it, give it back to the owner. Amr of Amram. Amram says, Afana namitnina. We learned this in a Mishnah as well. What does it say? It says, Kol ma'isa Beis Din. Any action, any real, legitimate, sanctioned document from Beis Din, harezeh yachzir, should be returned. Al malach hashin l'parayin, we see we're not worried about things being paid off. Amar le'er b'zera, that's not true. You don't have a raya from there, because Masnisin, that Mishnah that you mentioned, was b'shtari chaltasa va'adrachta, the lav b'nei parayininu. That line that you're quoting, that it says a ma'isa Beis Din should be returned, is not talking about a case where it's a document that is dealing with payment. What it's talking about is a document that was used to substantiate a property transfer. The Rashi says, "B'shtar chaltasa," it's shtar shekasvu Beis Din lemotzi shtar al chavero. The person took out a document on his friend. V'chayvu l'shalem v'lo shilei. He was obligated to pay but didn't. V'yardu l'nechasav. They ultimately went to his property. V'shamu l'bal chov echad mehem v'nosnu lo shtar sh'al pi Beis Din balo. This is talking about a case where a person owes money. He did not pay it back. The case went to Beis Din. And Beis Din said, you know what? We're going to write a document saying we're evaluating the person's property, and that's the property that you could ultimately collect from. And what's the drachta? A drachta is the document that actually affirms that transfer. Now, those documents are not documents that are used to extract money from somebody. Why? Because those documents are used just to ultimately affirm that a transfer took place. Amarava, is that really true? Tahani lav b'nei parayininu. Are those documents not documents that can be used for payment? V'amri Nardai taught us shuma hadar, that if Beis Din evaluates someone's field, and the person ultimately wants to pay money instead of it, he could reverse that evaluation. Ad tracer yarchishata, up until a year. So again, let's just analyze the case. Reuven borrows money from Shimon, and he can't pay it up. So Shimon says, listen, Reuven, I need the money. If you're not going to pay me up, we'll go to Beis Din. They go to Beis Din. Reuven says, I can't pay. So Beis Din evaluates Reuven's fields and says, here, we're going to sign this document that this field now goes to Shimon. He has to pay up with his real estate. Now, the halacha is, up until 12 months, he could reverse that, he could buy it back. So you see clearly that document does have some type of monetary collecting power. Amar Meir said, Anami Nardana, I'm from Nardav Svirali, and I'm of the opinion that this evaluation can be reversed by him buying it back. The Gemara says, Shumahadar La'olam. It goes back forever. Rava says, Hasam Hainu Taima. The reason why we don't give it back, or we do give it back, is because the Amri Ihu Huda Afsada Nafshe. He himself is responsible for this. He's the one who loses out. Why? The moment that he paid him up with this property, he should have torn up this document. The fact that he didn't tear it up is his own problem. So it's not that we're worried about Pirayin, that we're worried about it being paid up. We're worried about the fact, in other words, it's his problem. He paid up, he got the document back, he should have torn up this document, which would be a problem. The fact that he didn't tear it up is his own problem. Inami l'michtav shtora chrina ilvei. He should have written another document about the transfer. So listen, I owe you money, but ultimately, there's another document that says I paid you up, I'm giving you my property. And the Gemara explains, the Medina aro lo boy l'mahader. Really, from the halachic perspective, he doesn't have to give back the land. Rather, umishum dvasisa yasher bato b'nei Hashem hu de'amar Rabbanan tihader. What's the reason that we allow the person to be able to buy back his property? Is because there's a pasuk that says vasisa yasher bato b'nei Hashem. Recognizing that a person borrowed money because he needed money, and recognizing the person was honest, he tried to pay back the loan but he couldn't, and he paid back the loan with his real estate, and recognizing that's a very unfortunate situation, but the pasuk says, "Vasisa yasher v'atov." Recognize that you should do what's right and just. This person really needs his property. He wants his property. He never had intention to lose the property. Now he has money. Do the right thing. Let the guy buy back his property. But the reality is, in the Asisa Yasher v'atov, doing what's right and just in this case is really selling him back his property. It's a brand new sale. So therefore, Hilkach Mariasha Hu de Kazavin. He's really selling it back as a brand new sale. He should have written a new document. In other words, what we're explaining over here is that the reason why you can give back these documents is because there should be no problem that comes out from it. The fact that the document is there, maybe he bought it back. Maybe he did buy it back. But ultimately, if you bought it back, you should have written a new document. If you have all the documents in place, nobody will lose out. What should we say about a case where there's a shtarchov, where a person is actually finding a document of a loan on the street? In such a case, in other words, what you're saying is you can always return a loan document, because if he paid up, he should have torn it up. The problem is, maybe the lender didn't give it back to him right away. Maybe he was saying to him, you know what, thank you for paying up the loan. I'll give it back to you tomorrow. I don't have it here. It's at home in my file cabinet. Well, I'll come to shul tomorrow morning. I'll bring it to you. And the next day says, ooh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to bring it. You know what? Give me till next week to find it. Keeps pushing him off. So he paid back the loan because he wants to pay back the loan. Maybe he just didn't get the document. So now the guy dropped, ultimately, the lender drops the document. And you're saying you can give the document back to him. You're going to give him the power to collect twice. And he says, he says to him, L'machar, tomorrow yahavna lach. The Gemara says, Tahashta lese gaboy, inami apshiti desafra zarele. It's possible that in those cases he's holding it back because he wants to charge him the fees that he incurred to actually get it written. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Ravo says, name Rabbi Yochanan. Motzei shtar chov bashuk. A person finds a loan document in the street. Afal pi shekasa bo henpik. Even though it has the stamp, the seal of Beis Din on it, lo yachziru l'bayla. You should not give it back to the bayla. So this clearly does not agree with Shmuel. Shmuel said earlier, you give it back. Here he says, you find a document that has a seal of Beis Din on it, don't give it back. Lo miba, you don't even have to point out heicha de lo kasav bo hempik. In a case where it's not a verified document, the ikul meimer kasav livos v'lo lava. You could even say that, you know what? The reason why you shouldn't give it back is because maybe the whole thing never happened. The document was written, but it was never stamped and affirmed by Beis Din, and therefore you actually never borrowed the money. Elafilu kasav bo hempik, even if it actually has the stamp and the seal of Beis Din, he should not give it back. Umay nihu demikoyim. That means that it's actually verified. Lo yachzer, don't give it back. Why the chashinan? We're worried lepirayin that it was paid back. Where it says Esvei Rabbi Yirmiyah or Bava. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the following questions for Bava. It says Kol Ma'aseh Beis Din Reisa Yachzer. We learned earlier that anything which is a Ma'aseh Beis Din, anything that has Beis Din's signature on it, should be given back. Amalei Bava Amalei Yirmiyah Bri. Yirmiyah, my son. I don't know, Yirmiyah was not his son, but he still used the language of my son. Lo kol ma'aseh Beis Din shavin. Not all actions of Beis Din are the same. Ela kagon shahuchzak kafron. This is talking about a case where the guy is an established liar. He perjured himself once before. He lied before, and therefore in that case we don't take his word for it. You're telling me that just because a guy was caught lying once, that means he's never going to pay back again, and therefore you're always going to give back documents to the lender because you assume the guy doesn't pay? It's again, our mission is not talking about a loan document. That case is not talking about a loan document. It's talking about a case where it was just a Beis Din document affirming something happened. We'll stop here, and Amir Hashem tomorrow. Kamal Akiva giving share tomorrow. Kamal Akiva will take you through this very interesting Gemara tomorrow. I'll see everybody with Hashem on Sunday. Have a good Shabbos.